We are in the final weeks of the U.S. presidential election, and Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump remain in a virtual tie. Joining me with the latest developments is Chris Krueger, Managing Director at TD Cowen Washington Research Group. Chris, it's always a pleasure to have you with us. I'm starting to count the days to the election like you do, and I think the way you've been saying this is like 13 days, 13 news cycles, or whatever, 300 and some odd hours to go. But how much more can we take with these news cycles before the day happens?
Well, it is 2024. So the one thing we always try to tell clients is expect the unexpected. I would be shocked if there wasn't one more incredible plot twist.
Let's talk about what we're seeing then, at least on the ground right now, because there's some pretty intense campaigning, as there always is. But is there anything you're seeing in terms of maybe where they're campaigning or who they're campaigning with that has you thinking, that they understand where they stand right now and give you a hint as to where things stand?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, it remains the 7 key states in the 2 regions of the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt. We're in the blocking and tackling part of the campaign right now. Kamala Harris is in Michigan with Eminem, and she's in Philadelphia with Bruce Springsteen. Donald Trump is in a lot of those 7 states. He also has the big rally in Madison Square Garden in Midtown Manhattan. So, both campaigns are executing on the strategies that they think will take them to victory in 350 hours.
I started off by saying that it's the polls, and some of the polls are saying they're in a virtual tie. I'm seeing others that are pointing to the fact that they think Trump is ahead. What's your sense of things at this point?
It's really going to come down to executing on the campaign plans. It's blocking and tackling. We've never really had an election where you've had the 7 key battleground states within the margin of error. So, stay tuned. I think one area we have been looking at a bit more are the early votes, because November 5th isn't when voting begins. That's when voting ends. We've had something like 20 million votes already cast. Each state is a little bit different how they report those votes, but by and large, the states report if you're a registered Republican, a registered Democrat, or a registered independent. The Democrats are building up a firewall of votes in those Rust Belt states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. Republicans are outperforming in that Sun Belt region. So all signs point to another extremely close election.
You talk about that, and it's a great note that that's when voting ends. And then you actually have a bullet in your latest report that says election night equals election winter. Expand on that in terms of what we should expect.
Yeah, well, look, it's going to be something in the neighborhood of 150 million votes cast. That's going to take a long time to count. A lot of these states cannot begin processing those early votes until election day. Michigan Secretary of State has already said it's going to take them through Wednesday. Pennsylvania will probably go into the weekend. If you recall, in 2020, the race wasn't decided until a little bit before noon on Saturday following the election. There are something like 170 lawsuits already filed across 37 states. So, litigation is coming. Hopefully winter is not coming for the election counts. But, we could still have counts up until December 11th. December 17th is when the states certify the presidential elections.
I think, it's a lot. And again, we're saying this as Canadians watching. I'm sure it's a lot for you, covering this moment by moment, trying to understand where it's going. There's a lot of, maybe you tell me, is it unusual to see some of the things we're seeing? You mentioned about all the superstars that Kamala Harris is out campaigning with. I know that, we've got Elon Musk right now campaigning, doing some pretty interesting things. I think that the Obamas are going to be campaigning with Kamala Harris in Michigan soon. You got Trump coming up in Nevada, which I think people are watching that one very closely. Tell me kind of what you're going to be watching over these 13 news cycles to give you any hints. And again, I know it only matters when it matters at the end, but what are you seeing that's going to pique your attention?
Yeah, I mean, I think looking at the early votes and then where the candidate's spending time, Harris is also going to Houston, Texas. The idea there, maybe that Texas is in play. I mean, Texas hasn't voted for a Democrat in some time. You do have a key Senate race there. Texas has also sort of been ground zero for the reproductive rights push, given what the Supreme Court did with Roe v. Wade. So would expect a couple news cycles on the abortion issue, on reproductive rights. We'll see, with 13 cycles to go. I didn't have this weekend's um, uh, events on my bingo card. I do think there are probably a couple more wild cards. There are no more debates, though. I mean, that is what is typically in the last 2 weeks of a presidential election is a final kind of crystallizing debate. So it's going to be two very different campaigns executing two very different strategies. I think the get out the vote operation is also something to keep an eye on. Democrats really sort of executing on the traditional Democratic playbook, organized labor, but then you also have to give a shout out to the Swifties once again. We've seen record 18 to 35-year-old female voter registration. Is that being picked up in the polls? I'm not sure. You had mentioned Musk. A lot of the Republican get out the vote operation is focused on his super PAC, as well as a lot of election integrity focus. So Republican lawyers focusing on the polls on November 5th, as opposed to really harvesting the early vote before November 5th.
And just call out the obvious, just because it's my job, is just when you're talking about the Taylors and the Swifties, I mean, that 18 to 25, you would think that would lean obviously more Democrat. And so that would be something, if it's not being counted, it's something that could give them a bit of a tailwind.
For sure. I mean, there's just this very wide gulf. You have very smart people making, two very diametrically opposed arguments. And the first one is that, look, this is just the third version of pollsters under-reporting the silent Trump voter. We saw this in 2016 and we saw this in 2020. Don't overthink it. If we're inside the margin of error, Trump's going to win. The flip of that argument is based on two things. It's what we call the Nikki Haley primary voters, which are substantial, particularly in those 7 states that, these are sort of the silent Harris voters this time around. But then also that pollsters are not capturing those newly registered voters because they've never voted before. And they're going to show up in droves in a lot of those 7 states. What do those 7 states have in common? They all have a lot of college campuses.
We've been talking, of course, about what you've been watching on the ground game. Let's move ourselves right into election night. You've already said we're probably not going to know, obviously, at the end of election night. But tell me what states you're watching, which races, what's going to give us maybe a hint at what direction we might be moving in.
No, it's a great question. I think there are 3 states we're watching because they're all on the East Coast. They all close early and they all count relatively early. These aren't states that are necessarily competitive, but we do think they are going to give you a sense, at least, maybe, and if there is a wave one way or the other. So the first one's Virginia. If you remember 2016, this was the first state where we really got a sense that Trump might win because it took so long to call the state for Hillary Clinton. So in 2024, if we're past 8 p.m. and the state hasn't been called for Harris, that's a really good sign for Donald Trump. There are also a couple of very competitive House races in Virginia. The second state is Florida. That's basically the reverse of Virginia. If Florida hasn't been called for Donald Trump really by about midnight, that's a pretty good sign for Kamala Harris. There's also a key Senate race in Florida that the Republicans are very likely to win. If somehow that race was very close or the Democrats won that seat, that would be a big deal and a really good sign for Harris. And then the third state is North Carolina. This is one of the key 7 battleground states. We should get some early views on this. It does count relatively early. So those are the 3 we're watching election night. So hopefully at least by midnight, we'll have some sense of where we're headed.
Yeah, and then the debate begins. Last time we talked, I know you had said that you thought the Senate was going Republican, the House going Democrat. Are you still feeling that's the same direction it's moving into?
I am, with one caveat that we're definitely not going to know the House outcome. That's because so many of the House seats, which are competitive, are in the state of California. California doesn't close until 11 p.m. Eastern. California is also a bit notorious for very long counts. So we probably won't know the House outcome until the weekend. The House numbers and geography just favor the Democrats. That's reversed in the Senate. The Democrats have just a really tough map. It's theoretical for Democrats to hold the Senate, but you'd essentially have to have a clean sweep.
And I feel like, we're so focused on the election, but there's so many things happening. Debt ceiling, of course, taxes, the fiscal cliff. Like, what are you expecting that's going to be front and center as we keep moving forward?
Yeah, well, I mean, so much of what happens next year is dictated by these scheduled catalysts, which happen regardless of election outcome. So we will hit our heads on the debt ceiling January 1st, regardless of election outcome. Now, extraordinary measures will kick in. We won't have an X date question around U.S. defaults until probably June, maybe as late as October, but that's going to be a really big issue next year, regardless. And then regardless of election outcome, we have a $5 trillion fiscal tax cliff at the end of next year. It's the largest scheduled tax increase in American history. When the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act individual rates all sunset, you also have the expiration of what's known as the Obamacare subsidies, which help Americans buy health insurance on the Affordable Care Act exchanges. So depending on election outcome, you could literally have a $15 trillion fiscal delta between the two campaigns or the two candidates and how the Congress shakes out.
I've only got a minute left. This is an unfair question to ask you with a minute left, but I think that, are there any surprises you think that could come from either Trump 2.0 or Kamala Harris that maybe people haven't been thinking as deeply about that could be material?
I do think regardless of election outcome, the M&A environment is going to improve. The tech policy environment is going to improve. And we are likely to get a meaningful CapEx cycle on the decarbonization efforts because a lot of the key components of the Inflation Reduction Act are going to be safe regardless of election outcome. So let's finish with a bit of good news.